The stagecoach didn't stop at the station. It stopped in the middle of Main Street, horses screaming, wheels skidding sideways through the dust until the whole rig shuddered to a halt in front of the Mercantile. A woman tumbled out before it had even finished moving.
Come on, get moving!
Her traveling dress, fine wool, the kind no one in Larkspur Creek had ever seen up close, was torn at the hem and stained at the knees. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and hung in damp strands against her neck. But it was her eyes that stopped people on the boardwalk mid-step, sharp, frightened, scanning the street the way a person does when they've spent weeks learning which doors lead to safety and which lead nowhere at all. 3 men dropped down from the coach roof behind her, boots hitting the dirt hard. That's far enough. The lead man drew a pistol, slow and deliberate, like he'd done it before and didn't mind doing it again. "You're coming back with us, miss, one way or another." The whole street went still. Old Pete Bannon stopped sweeping his porch. The blacksmith's hammer froze mid-swing. Nobody in Wyoming territory dressed like her. Nobody talked to a woman like that in the open street either, not in Larkspur Creek. She backed toward the saloon doors, both hands raised, eyes darting for any gap in the men surrounding her. That's when a tall man in a weathered hat swung down off his horse at the end of the street, slow and unhurried, like he had all the time in the world and intended to use it. "Gentlemen," his voice carried without him raising it. "I don't believe the lady asked for company." The lead man turned, sizing him up. Broad shoulders, sun-worn hands, the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of solving problems without needing to shout about it. "This isn't your business, cowboy." "Funny thing about this town," Jake Holloway said, stepping between the woman and the gun without so much as a glance at it. "Folks here tend to make other people's business their own, especially when it involves a lady and 3 armed men outnumbering her." He was a princess running from a crown she never asked for. He was a cowboy who had no idea the woman he'd just stepped in front of was worth more, in gold, in politics, in scandal, than his ranch, his town, and half the territory combined. Neither of them knew it standing there in the dust, but over the next 30 days, that single moment on Main Street would unravel both of their lives and stitch them back together into something neither one expected. Before we go any further, if you're already hooked, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It helps this channel more than you know, and trust me, this story only gets better from here. Amelia hadn't planned to run all the way to America. She'd only planned to run. The night before her engagement was to be announced to the court, she slipped out through the servants' gate wearing a maid's traveling cloak, carrying 1 bag of jewelry she intended to sell piece by piece for passage and food. A coach to the coast under cover of darkness. A ship's berth booked under a borrowed name, Amelia Reyes, governess, traveling to a teaching post in New York. 6 weeks at sea, jumping at every knock on her cabin door, certain her father's men were always 1 port behind her. They were. The Duke's household had sent agents within hours of discovering her empty bed, and Velmoria's own court, desperate to avoid scandal, sent a second team not far behind the first. By the time her ship docked in New York Harbor, the trail had already picked up her scent through a careless porter who remembered a foreign woman traveling alone and paying too well for silence. She kept moving west, by train as far as the line went, then by stagecoach into territory so open and empty it felt like falling off the edge of the known world. Each mile put more distance behind her, and for the first time in weeks she allowed herself to believe she might actually be free. Larkspur Creek was as far west as the stage line ran. It was also as far as her luck ran. The 3 men who'd been a day behind her in Cheyenne finally closed the gap the moment she stepped down into the street. Jake hadn't planned on getting involved in anyone else's trouble that morning. He'd ridden into town for feed and rope, nothing more, with Tom riding alongside him grumbling about the cost of grain. But Jake had grown up watching his father step between bullies and the people they bullied, and some habits don't ask permission before they show up. "You got a name?" he asked her once the 3 men had backed off grumbling and ridden out of town with nothing to show for the trouble. "Amelia." It was at least true. "Well, Amelia." He looked her over, fine fabric gone ragged at the seams, a bag clutched two-handed like it held the whole of her life, which it very nearly did. "You got somewhere to be?" She didn't. Not anywhere safe, anyway. "I can pay for a few nights at the boarding house," she said, though they both knew from the look of her that this wasn't entirely true either. Jake glanced at Tom, who shrugged in the universal language of your call, boss. "Tell you what," Jake said. "My housekeeper quit on me last spring to marry a railroad man in Cheyenne, and I haven't had a decent meal since. You willing to cook, clean, and not ask too many questions about why I never learned to do either myself, I've got a room and steady pay. No questions asked about whatever you're running from either. Man doesn't need to know everybody's business to know they need help." She should have said no. She'd promised herself, somewhere around the third week at sea, that she would trust no one until she'd built an entirely new life, brick by careful brick with nobody close enough to threaten it. But something about the offer, no questions asked, felt like the first kindness in this country that didn't come with strings attached. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." She told herself it was temporary, a place to breathe before she figured out her next move, wherever that might be. She had no idea it would become the only place she ever wanted to stay. The first week, Amelia burned 3 suppers, ruined a batch of bread so thoroughly that Tom used the loaf to prop open the barn door as a joke, and fell off a fence twice trying to learn how to mend it. Jake never once laughed at her, though she caught him biting back a smile more than once, and Tom had no such restraint at all. "You weren't raised to do this kind of work," Jake said one evening, watching her wrap a blistered hand in a dish towel by the kitchen fire. "No," she admitted with a small, rueful laugh. "I wasn't raised to do much of anything useful at all. I could tell you the correct seating order for a state dinner with 12 foreign dignitaries. I have never once boiled an egg without supervision. Different kind of education, I suppose. A very expensive, very useless kind." She told him pieces of the truth, carefully chosen, the way a person hands over coins one at a time instead of opening the whole purse. That she'd left a family who controlled every part of her future. That she'd left a man she was expected to marry but had never loved, not for a single day. She left out the palace, the crown, the kingdom entirely. Those felt like another woman's life, one she was in no hurry to reclaim, not even in conversation. Jake didn't push. He'd learned a long time ago, watching his own father grieve his mother in silence for years before finally speaking of her, that people told you what they needed to when they were ready and not one moment before. Instead, he taught her things. How to sit a horse properly instead of clutching the reins like the animal might bolt out from under her at any second. How to read the sky for weather a full day before it arrived. How to shoot badly at first. The first 3 shots went wide enough that Tom had to duck behind the water trough, laughing so hard he could barely catch his breath, until one golden afternoon she hit a fence post 3 times running and let out a whoop so undignified it would have scandalized every tutor she'd ever had. He found himself looking forward to supper in a way he hadn't in years. Not for the food, which still occasionally betrayed her best intentions, but for the hour after, when the dishes were cleared and they sat on the porch steps and talked about things that had nothing to do with cattle prices or fence lines. "What do you want this place to look like in 20 years?" she asked him one night, the two of them watching more stars than she'd ever seen at once spill across the Wyoming sky. "Bigger barn," he said. "Maybe a school close enough the kids in the valley don't have to ride 2 hours each way. A wife who doesn't mind the smell of cattle, I suppose, though I hear that's a tall order." He glanced sideways at her. "You'd know better than me. You ever think that far ahead, or were you always too busy running from something to plan toward something?" It was the first time he'd asked gently about the life she'd left. "I used to only plan how to escape," she admitted. "I never let myself plan what came after because I never believed I'd get that far." She tucked her knees up, hugging them. "I think now I'd like a garden, something that's mine because I planted it, not because someone handed me a title and called it inheritance. I'd like mornings that belong to me instead of a schedule someone else wrote out for the year." "Sounds like a fine kind of future," Jake said quietly. "Cheaper than mine, too." She laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she hadn't let herself have in years, and something passed between them on that porch step that neither one was ready to name out loud. Word got around town the way it always does in small places. Folks noticed Jake Holloway had started smiling more, started lingering an extra minute outside the Mercantile when there was no real reason to. Noticed the foreign woman at his ranch had stopped looking like she was waiting to leave and started looking like she'd arrived somewhere on purpose. Not everyone in town was pleased about it. Sarah Whitfield, the banker's daughter, had spent the better part of 2 years hoping Jake might eventually notice her at the Sunday socials, and she did not take kindly to a mysterious stranger doing in 3 weeks what she hadn't managed in 2 years. "There's something off about her," Sarah told her mother over tea, loud enough for half the church social to overhear. "Nobody just arrives like that. No family, no letters, dressed like she stepped out of a society page nobody's ever heard of. Mark me, that woman is hiding something, and it's going to come back on poor Jake when it does." She wasn't wrong, though it gave her no satisfaction to be right later. Old Mrs. Calloway, who ran the general store and missed nothing that happened within 50 miles, had a gentler read on it. "That girl's hiding something big," she told her husband one night, restocking shelves by lamplight. "But whatever it isn't bigger than the way she looks at him when he's not watching." She wasn't wrong about that part either. By the 3rd week, a storm rolled through the valley that knocked down half a mile of fence and scattered the herd across 2 ridgelines. Jake, Tom, and Amelia spent 2 full days in the mud and the cold chasing cattle back where they belonged, and on the 2nd night, soaked through and exhausted, Amelia laughed so hard at the sight of Jake covered head to boot in mud that she fell over backward into a puddle herself. He hauled her up by both hands, and for a moment neither of them let go. "You're ruined," he told her, grinning despite the disaster of the day. "Hands like a princess when you got here. Look at you now." "I have never in my life been happier to be ruined," she said. He kissed her then, careful, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to, and when she didn't pull away, not careful at all. The valley held a barn dance every spring, the kind of event nobody in Larkspur Creek would have missed for anything short of a blizzard. Jake hadn't planned to bring anyone in particular, the way he hadn't planned much of anything since Amelia arrived, but when he found himself standing at the edge of the Hendersons' barn watching her hesitate in the doorway, unsure whether a hired housekeeper was meant to dance at all, he crossed the floor without thinking twice. "You know how to do this?" he asked, holding out a hand. "I have danced at 3 royal balls and 2 state dinners," she said. "I have never once danced where the steps weren't written down in advance for me to memorize." "Well," Jake said, "out here nobody writes it down. You just go where the music takes you and try not to step on anybody's boots too often." It took her 3 songs to stop counting steps under her breath, and by the 4th she'd stopped entirely, laughing freely at her own missteps instead of apologizing for them. Tom watched from the punch table with the particular satisfaction of a man who'd guessed the ending of a story long before the characters in it had caught up, and even Sarah Whitfield, watching from across the barn with her arms folded, had to admit, grudgingly to her mother later that night, that she had never once seen Jake Holloway smile quite like that at anybody. They walked home under a moon bright enough to see the road by, neither of them in any particular hurry to arrive. "In Velmoria," Amelia said, "there is a dance reserved only for engagements. The whole court learns to read it like a language, who is courting whom, who has been refused, who is merely being polite. I used to find it elegant. Tonight I found it sad compared to this. Nobody here needed permission to enjoy themselves." "That bother you? Folks here not having much elegance to speak of?" "No," she said, and meant it completely. "I think I have had quite enough elegance to last several lifetimes. I find I much prefer this." He took her hand the rest of the way home, and neither one of them let go until the porch light came into view. By the 4th week, Jake had stopped pretending to himself that this was just a hired hand learning the ropes. By the 4th week, Amelia had stopped pretending this was a temporary stop on a longer journey to somewhere else. The trouble was, she still hadn't told him who she really was, and the longer the truth waited in the corner of every quiet moment between them, the heavier it grew. The newspaper arrived in Larkspur Creek 2 days late, same as always, carried up from the railhead in the mail sack along with seed catalogs and a letter Tom had been waiting on for weeks. Jake almost didn't bother reading it that evening. The herd had given him trouble all morning, and supper was waiting, and Amelia had promised, with a mischievous look, that tonight's bread would not require Tom's services as a doorstop. Then a headline on the third page stopped him cold, coffee cup halfway to his mouth. Missing Princess of Velmoria feared fled to America. Kingdom offers substantial reward for her safe return. Beneath it, an illustration, formal, stiff-collared and unsmiling, the way royal portraits always were. But the eyes, sharp, watchful, unmistakably hers, were the same eyes that had looked up at him over supper not 20 minutes earlier. Jake sat with that paper a long time before he found her in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, humming something under her breath while she checked the bread. "Is this you?" He laid the paper flat on the table between them, the illustration facing up. She looked at it. She didn't reach for it. She didn't try to explain it away or talk her way around it, though every instinct from 23 years of court training screamed at her to do exactly that. She just nodded. "I should have told you," she said quietly. "I wanted to, more times than you'd believe. I kept telling myself there'd be a better moment, and then there never was one, because there's no good moment to tell a man you've been lying about who you are since the day he met you." Jake didn't shout. That wasn't his way, and never had been. But something in his face closed off, careful and guarded, like a man checking a fence he'd believed solid and finding the posts rotted through underneath. "You let me believe you were running from a bad engagement," he said. "Not a whole kingdom. Not a price on your head that could feed this whole valley for a decade. Was any of it true, Amelia? Any of it?" All of it was true. Her voice cracked just slightly. "The engagement, the man I didn't love, the family who decided my whole life without once asking what I wanted, every word of that was true. I only left out the part that made it sound impossible instead of merely sad." Before either of them could say anything more, the sound of horses came up the road outside. More than one rider, moving with purpose, the kind of unhurried confidence that belonged to men who were used to being obeyed. Through the kitchen window, Jake saw fine coats and polished boots that had no business being covered in Wyoming dust, and a crest stitched into a saddlebag that matched exactly the one printed beneath that newspaper illustration. The royal agents had found her. There were 4 of them, led by a stern, gray-templed man who introduced himself at the door with a bow so formal it looked entirely out of place on a dirt porch in cattle country. "Your Highness?" Castellan Marsh straightened, addressing Amelia with the careful courtesy of a man who'd crossed an ocean to deliver an unwelcome message. "Your father is beside himself with worry. Duke Conrad's family grows impatient, and the alliance with Hessenmoor hangs by a thread. We are here to escort you home immediately, before the matter becomes a true diplomatic incident." "And if I refuse?" "Then Velmoria risks open conflict with a kingdom 3 times its size, Your Highness. Forgive me for saying it plainly, but this was never only your choice to make. A crown carries obligations a private citizen does not." Jake stood at the edge of the porch, jaw tight, saying nothing at first, because this wasn't his fight to win or lose on her behalf. But when Amelia's eyes found his across the porch, searching, almost apologizing, he stepped forward anyway. "She's not property," Jake said, voice even but unmistakably firm. "Whatever crown you put on her, whatever paper you've got with her name and some duke's name written on it, she's still allowed to decide her own life. That's not a foreign idea. Folks around here believe in it pretty strongly." "This is not your concern, rancher." "Reckon it is, if it concerns her." Word had already spread through Larkspur Creek. Mrs. Calloway had seen to that within the hour, as she always did, and by the time voices started rising on the Holloway porch, half the town had quietly gathered along the fence line. Nobody said much. Tom stood closest, arms crossed, jaw set. Even Sarah Whitfield, despite every reason to enjoy watching this unravel, stood among them with her arms folded the same defensive way as everyone else. They simply stood there, a wall of plain, unimpressed faces, making it clear without a single shout whose side this town had chosen. Castellan Marsh glanced at them, visibly unsettled by an audience he hadn't planned for. Amelia looked at the agents. She looked at the gathered town. She looked longest of all at Jake. I spent my whole life being told my choices belong to other people, she said, her voice steady now, stronger than it had been at any point since stepping off that stagecoach a month before. I was told who to marry, what to wear, which words to say at which dinners, and I obeyed every single instruction because I believed obedience was the same thing as love for my country. I don't believe that anymore. I love Velmoria. I will always love it, but I won't sell my whole future to protect it, not when there might be another way. There may not be another way, Your Highness, Marsh said not unkindly. Then find one, she said. Tell my father his daughter would rather help him search for a different solution than hand him an easy one built on her own unhappiness. Tell him I haven't abandoned Velmoria. I've simply stopped abandoning myself for it. Castellan Marsh studied her for a long moment, searching perhaps for the obedient girl he remembered from court functions years earlier, and finding instead someone he no longer entirely recognized. You understand what you are risking, he said, quieter now, almost gentle. Not just the marriage, Your Highness, your place in the line of succession. Your father may not forgive this easily. There are members of the court who will call this an abdication in all but name. Then let them call it that, Amelia said. I would rather be remembered as a princess who chose her own life than one who simply inherited a crown and never once questioned what it cost the people who wore it before me. If Velmoria needs an heir who never asks questions, it has my brother. If it needs a daughter who loves it enough to find a harder, better answer than the easy one, it still has me. It will simply have to accept that I intend to love it from here. Marsh said nothing for a long moment. Behind him, one of the other agents shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the silent wall of townsfolk along the fence as if recalculating for the first time whether 4 men on horseback were truly enough to argue with an entire valley. Your father will not be pleased, he said finally. My father, Amelia said, will have to learn to be pleased with a daughter who's finally happy, or he'll lose me a second time, and this time I won't leave a trail to follow. It took 6 more weeks of letters crossing the ocean before Velmoria's court found a solution that satisfied everyone except perhaps Duke Conrad's pride. Amelia's younger brother, Prince Theodore, who had quietly resented the arranged marriage on his sister's behalf from the start, proposed a revised trade agreement directly to Hessenmoor's ministers, one built on grain exports and mining rights instead of a wedding contract. It took longer to negotiate, it held just as firm. King Aldrich never did learn to love the idea of his daughter raising cattle in a territory he couldn't find on most maps without help. But he came to love the letters she sent twice a month, full of stories about a life he never could have given her himself. A barn dance where she danced badly and laughed loudly, a calf she'd helped deliver in the middle of the night, a garden that was, finally, entirely her own. You were right about one thing, Father, she wrote in her final letter before the wedding. You always said a Velmorian princess carries her kingdom with her wherever she goes. I think I finally understand what you meant. I simply carry it differently than you imagined. The wedding happened that spring, right there on Holloway land, beneath a sky so wide and clear it looked ordered specially for the occasion. There was no cathedral, no marble, no foreign dignitaries seated by rank, just a town full of people who'd watched a stranger become one of their own, gathered around 2 people who'd found each other entirely by accident and chosen each other entirely on purpose. Tom stood as Jake's best man and only just managed to keep his toast under 5 minutes. Mrs. Calloway cried through the entire ceremony and told anyone who'd listen, repeatedly, that she'd known it from the very first week. Even Sarah Whitfield came, brought a gift and danced twice, proof, Mrs. Calloway said later, that the whole valley had finally come around. King Aldrich did not attend, but Prince Theodore did, traveling further than he ever had in his life to stand in for a family still learning how to let go, and he gave away his sister himself, hand in hand down a path lined with wildflowers instead of marble. He stayed 3 weeks afterward, long enough to learn how to saddle a horse badly, eat supper at a table with no assigned seating, and tell his sister the night before he sailed home that he had never seen her look more like herself than she did standing in a cattle pasture in a borrowed apron. Father will come around, he told her. Slowly, but he will. He already asks about you more than he lets on. Tell him, Amelia said, that his daughter is happy. Tell him that's worth more to the kingdom than any treaty ever could have been. Years later, when their children asked how their parents met, Jake told it simple. Your mother showed up in town one morning causing a fair bit of trouble, and I figured somebody ought to find out what she was about. Amelia always told it differently. I came to this country running from a life that wasn't mine, she'd say, gathering her children close by the fire the same way Jake once gathered cattle scattered after a storm. And in the unlikeliest place in the whole wide world, a dusty little cattle town nobody back home had ever heard of, I found exactly where I was always meant to be. If this story moved you even a little, do me a favor. Like this video, leave a comment with your favorite moment, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Stories like Amelia and Jake's only keep coming if you stick around for them. See you in the next one.